Hello, back again. This is Mary, your learning parent in Indianapolis, Indiana. I'm talking with Dr. Phil Harris and Joan Harris, who is the author of The Myth of Standardized Testing with Bruce Smith. And now, if you haven't watched the other videos, please look them out there on YouTube. But the last thing last question I want to ask is, about your parents have a lot of assumptions, and community members, and even, some teachers I've even coming across about assumptions about standardized testing. Again, these video clips are about empowerment through knowledge, and so I'm going to talk with Phil and Joanne about what is their knowledge about the basic assumptions of standardized testing.
Well, one of the first things that I think is important to reflect on is the assumption that student knowledge can be assessed by a limited number of questions in a limited amount of time.
I want to speak to that point because in my, just trying to find out information, one of the things I came across, and I can't remember, I think it was Grade School's website, that said that it's the testing profession's own ethical or joint, they call them joint standards, but they're ethical standards, that you don't assess a child using one test. Is that your experience as a professional educator, Joan? That when you're trying to assess a child, that you try not to just use one test or one form of assessment? Do you try to use multiple forms of assessment to make sure that you're getting the assessment correct?
Of course, multiple forms of assessment doesn't necessarily mean just a test.
Mm-hmm.
It can be a presentation. It can be other kinds of observations that you make of the child.
Okay, great. So far, we were talking, I apologize, I interrupted, the assumptions of individuals.
Well, the important concept here is that our current use of standardized tests assumes we are getting a valid and reliable estimate of what an individual knows in 45 minutes in a very limited sample of the content, whether it's reading or mathematics or literacy in general or science or social studies, as we will be testing here in Indiana in the coming years. And there's so much in that content domain, and to think about how much of that content we can sample in an hour.
Or 10 hours, as we're going into ISTEP testing this year.
Right. But any part of that is that we have to make choices about what content we are going to sample.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's driven by the standards.
Mm-hmm.
All right, now the content standards are interpreted on the individual district and individual school and individual classroom teachers.
Mm-hmm.
So we have no idea whether all teachers are interpreting the standard in exactly the same way and are teaching students in exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what the Common Core State Standards was hoping to do was to make sure that in fact is what happened.
Mm-hmm.
That we had generally accepted standards across the nation, and we had a single test that we could compare Massachusetts and Mississippi, for whatever reason anybody would want to do that, or Massachusetts and Indiana, or Massachusetts and Minnesota. I don't pick on Massachusetts necessarily, but the point is we are trying to make judgments for which we don't really have any good reason for wanting to make. But the first assumption dealing with that test is it's a very limited amount of time and a very limited amount of content. And that also brings up a second basic assumption, that an indirect observation is more valid and reliable than a direct observation.
And what do you mean by indirect observation?
Well, I have to infer from a number what that tells me about your reading, math, literacy, science, or social studies.
Okay.
If I want to know whether you can drive a car,
Yeah.
do I want to see your score on the paper and pencil driver test, or do I want to see you drive out this parking lot into the street and keep from running over people or other cars?
So that goes back to Joanne's talking
Exactly.
about there's multiple forms of assessment for children. And in, you know, through my own children and advocating, especially for my special needs kid, I brought to the IEP case conferences, okay, what is appropriate assessments? You know, the grades, you know, portfolios, where's the writing samples, you know, show me, prove to me he's doing what you're expecting him to do.
Yeah. Joan, as a classroom teacher, she had observational opportunities, which is a direct, not an indirect measure of performance. She actually sees them reading, not looks at a number on a test and say whether you can or can't read. Now, and this leads to a third very important assumption, that somehow people believe that tests are objective and the numbers are thought to be absolute. Now, you have to keep in mind that somebody somewhere decided what item was going to be used to test, what concept, or in technical language is what construct we're going to be testing. And so somebody made the decision, what are we going to test, how are we going to do it, and what are we going to accept as an appropriate answer. And there's nothing objective about any of that. That's all subjective. Now, and we also assume that all children they come to school at 6 years of age and they've all had the same background and same set of experiences.
We're talking about humans, okay?
Yeah, right.
First of all, most importantly, we're talking about humans.
And the
That
last,
learn differently too.
and maybe the last assumption to mention is that our general public has been led to believe that the test score is all you need to know about whether our schools are performing what they're supposed to be.
And their teachers too.
Yeah, and it's the least informative piece of information. Unfortunately, most of our legislators don't know the difference between accountability and evaluation. Now, accountability is simply reporting what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't you do it better? Oh, now you're switched to evaluation. And our legislators don't make a distinction between accountability and evaluation, mainly because they don't want to be evaluated, nor be accountable.
And their evaluation is the vote at the polls, basically. I apologize for the coffee noise in the background. And I guess, you know, when we're talking about standardized tests, are they appropriate? There's a lot of myths, there's a lot of assumptions. And again, this is about empowering parents and community through knowledge.